Dorothy Coleman moved through the terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport with the studied calm of someone who'd seen too much to be fazed by the bustle around her. At 71 years old, she had long since traded in any trappings of glamour for simple comfort. A soft gray crewneck sweater, faded khaki slacks, and well-worn leather loafers. Her silver hair was pulled back into a neat chignon, and a thin, unadorned bracelet, the only piece of jewelry she ever wore, glistened on her wrist. In her hands, she carried a canvas tote, its seams frayed, stuffed with an aging paperback and the essentials for a day's journey. She paused at a bank of departure boards, scanning the morning's flights. Steam rose from a nearby coffee cart, the aroma of rich espresso mingling with the sharp tang of jet fuel in the air. Families bustled past, rolling suitcases and corralling small children. Business travelers in crisp suits marched purposefully from gate to gate. None of them spared more than a glance for the modestly dressed older woman, standing quietly in their midst. Dorothy inhaled deeply, savoring a fleeting moment of stillness before turning toward Gate A-17, Liberty Jetways Flight 27, to Chicago. She had made this journey countless times before, but today felt different. She was headed to a charity gala honoring her son, Malcolm Coleman, and she knew he had arranged the event himself. Yet despite her pride in his accomplishments, her son was the CEO of one of the nation's fastest-growing airlines. She still worried about drawing too much attention. Public life had never been her preference. As she crossed the threshold into the priority boarding area, she noticed a cluster of passengers chatting quietly by the seating pods, executives in tailored blazers, a social media influencer live-streaming her surroundings, and two flight attendants standing off to the side. Their polished uniforms and rehearsed smiles contrasted starkly with Dorothy's unassuming appearance. A subtle shift rippled through the group as she passed. A man in a navy suit nudged his companion. One of the attendants, a tall woman with coiffed hair, gave Dorothy a once-over before returning to her phone. Dorothy's chest tightened, not with fear but with the weight of memory. She had faced silent judgment before, in segregated waiting rooms, on buses that wouldn't stop for her neighborhood, and in boardrooms where her contributions were dismissed. She had learned long ago that dignity was carried in one's bearing, not in the approval of strangers. She straightened her shoulders, smoothed the front of her sweater, and approached the gate agent's desk. "Good morning," she said, her voice gentle but steady. She placed her boarding pass on the counter. "First class, seat 1C. The agent scanned it without looking up. "Thank you, Mrs. Coleman. We're boarding now." The man handed back her pass with a practiced flourish and, without a word, motioned toward the side door. Dorothy tucked her tote under her arm and followed the path into the jet bridge. The narrow corridor hummed with overhead lighting, and the soft rumble of engines accompanied her every step. Ahead, the cabin door opened, and she took a moment to straighten. She stepped into the pale moo oasis of first class. The seats were arranged in a spacious one-to-one configuration, each one upholstered in chocolate leather, complete with heavy blankets and plush headrests. A faint scent of lavender perfume lingered in the air, the legacy of generations of carefully trained flight attendants. Dorothy paused at the front of the cabin, letting her eyes drift across the scene. A business executive typing on a tablet, a grandmother adjusting her silk scarf, a young couple sipping champagne. Steeling herself, Dorothy turned toward seat 1C. As she made her way down the aisle, she felt a series of curious glances, some sympathetic, most merely surprised. She offered a polite nod to a man in a dark suit who looked as though he'd rather be anywhere else. She slid into her seat, settled her tote at her feet, and straightened the paper bag she'd tucked onto her lap. The cabin fell quiet for a moment, as if holding its breath. Then footsteps echoed behind her, and Dorothy felt someone lean in, asking in a low voice, "Excuse me, ma'am, "Can I see your boarding pass again?" Dorothy met the attendant's gaze with calm, unyielding eyes. She lifted her hand, revealing the small silver bracelet that once belonged to her husband. "Of course," she replied softly. She turned her hand, palm up, allowing the attendant to scan the pass on her phone. The attendant's mouth tightened, and she hesitated, an almost imperceptible flicker of doubt in her eyes. Dorothy sensed the shift before the attendant forced a professional smile. "Thank you," the attendant said, handing back the pass. "Enjoy your flight." Dorothy's heart pounded not with fear, but with the quiet resolve of someone who had been tested far more severe trials. As the attendant moved on, Dorothy closed her eyes for a moment, leaning back into the seat. The leather embraced her gently. She inhaled the muted scent of the cabin, and for the first time in years, allowed herself a small, private smile. She was exactly where she belonged. Memories of the past flickered through Dorothy's mind. The day she and her late husband had pooled every penny to charter their first small aircraft, determined to build a new airline that would fly without prejudice. The founding documents they had filed, the midnight strategy sessions, the desperate bids for runway slots. She and her husband had poured their lives into the company they'd named Liberty Jetways. He'd passed 5 years ago, and since then, Dorothy had quietly stepped away from daily operations, content to watch her son carry on their dream. But that dream had always rested on the principle of equal treatment, an ideal she knew could falter if not vigilantly protected, which was why, years ago, she had included a legacy clause in the company's articles of incorporation, a secret right to veto any decision she deemed a violation of their founding values. No one knew it existed except Dorothy herself. She unfolded a small card from her sweater pocket, the corporate seal embossed in faded gold. She reflected on how, decades ago, that tiny clause had been put in place for a rainy day. She would never have imagined that the storm would arrive in the form of a silent disgrace in a first-class cabin. Ahead, the cabin lights dimmed slightly as the cabin crew prepared for takeoff. Dorothy glanced out the window, where the sun was climbing above a row of jet bridges and airport towers. In that moment, she felt a surge of purpose, a deep-seated conviction that justice demanded action. She would not be cowed by an offhand glance or an unspoken prejudice. The engines roared as the plane pushed back from the gate. Dorothy placed her hand over her heart, feeling the gentle thrum of power beneath her fingertips. She closed her book and stood, smoothing her sweater one last time. Today, she realized, would mark more than just another trip home. It would be the day she reminded the world why Liberty Jetways was built on principles that no one could ignore. And as the aircraft accelerated down the runway, lifting effortlessly into the sky, Dorothy Coleman looked out over the tarmac with clear eyes and steady breath. Somewhere in the heart of that powerful machine was her legacy, and she intended to see that it remained uncompromised. Dorothy Coleman slid into the aisle of Liberty Jetways Flight 207, inhaling the soft, perfumed hush of the first-class cabin. She paused for a heartbeat, letting her eyes adjust to the muted glow of overhead lamps reflecting off polished mahogany insets and cream-colored bulkheads. The seats were staggered in a wide 1-2-1 configuration, each one a plush leather throne outfitted with thick pillows, cashmere blankets, and touch-screen panels on the armrests. Yet, despite the veneer of luxury, she felt a prickling tension ripple through the space as soon as she crossed the threshold. She took her time walking to seat 1C, her assigned window seat, letting the occasional footstep announce her presence. A distinguished-looking older businessman in 1A glanced over with a polite nod. A young tech executive in 1D raised his eyebrows and returned to his laptop. A mother cradling an infant in 2A offered a warm smile, but most of the cabin turned away, offering only furtive side glances. As Dorothy passed, she noticed a cluster of magazine-clutching travelers lower their reading materials, haste flickering across their features, as if her simple gray sweater and faded khakis were a dissonant note in their carefully curated world. At the front of the cabin stood two flight attendants. The first, Caroline, possessed an air of aristocratic poise. Perfectly coiffed chestnut curls, a tailored navy blazer with brass buttons, and a crisp white scarf neatly knotted at her neck. She studied Dorothy with cool, appraising eyes before responding to a request from a passenger behind her. Next to Caroline, Mark, tall, lean, with sandy hair meticulously parted, smiled politely at a couple settling into 2B, then straightened his stance when he noticed Dorothy approaching. Dorothy slid into her seat. The leather embraced her gently, conforming to the curve of her spine. She tucked her tote under the seat in front of her and laid her paperback on the armrest, its spine softened from countless readings. She allowed herself a small, private exhale before reaching for the complimentary bottled water on the side table. "Good morning, Mrs. Coleman," a quiet voice said. Caroline had crossed the cabin in long strides, her expression composed but distant. She offered Dorothy a bottled water from a silver tray. "Welcome aboard Liberty Jetways. Can I get you anything else before departure?" Dorothy met her gaze and smiled politely. "Thank you. A cup of coffee, please? Black, if that's all right." Caroline's lips pressed into a practiced smile. "Of course. I'll have that right away." As Caroline turned, Mark stepped forward. His easy grin seemed almost genuine, but his eyes, those pale blue eyes, hovered on Dorothy's sweater. Her simple quilted tote, the unadorned silver bracelet on her wrist. "If you need anything else," he said softly, "just let me know." Dorothy nodded, her voice steady. "I will, thank you." Airline returned a moment later, balancing a porcelain cup and saucer on a lacquered tray. She placed it carefully in the cup holder next to Dorothy's seat. "Here you go," she said, voice light. But Dorothy caught the brief hesitation in Caroline's eyes, the flicker of judgment beneath the courteous facade. Her thoughts to Gleesy closed her eyes for a moment, lifting the cup to her lips. The coffee was rich and hot, filling her mouth with bitter clarity. She let the warmth spread through her, anchoring her to the present. Around her, the rest of the cabin settled into an uneasy lull. Overhead bins clicked shut, seatbelts clicked open. A hush descended as passengers prepared for takeoff. She counted the faint murmur of whispered conversations. A young woman 2 rows back murmuring to her companion, "Did you see her? She's just ordinary." A businessman in 1A clearing his throat before asking the flight attendant, "Is this really first class?" And then the flutter of tension as Caroline and Mark exchanged a quick look, a silent conference of disbelief that they were serving someone who didn't fit their definition of elite. Dorothy's fingers tightened around the edge of her saucer. She felt the familiar ache of old indignities, the time a bus driver refused her fare, the time a hotel clerk looked past her when she handed over her reservation card. But the world had changed since then. The airplane was her domain, the cabin her stage. She inhaled deeply, tasting the acrid tang of espresso and determination. The captain's voice floated through the intercom. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard Flight 207 to Chicago. We'll be wheels up in just a few minutes." His tone was friendly, oblivious to the small drama unfolding in the first class. Dorothy arranged her scarf, an heirloom piece of silk, muted burgundy with a floral print, around her neck. It was the only item she had chosen for travel today that reflected a hint of color. She adjusted her posture, sitting as though she belonged. Because she did. Mid-aisle, Caroline and Mark spoke in hushed tones. Dorothy leaned slightly to catch their words. "We need to double-check her name," Caroline said, voice low. Maybe there was a booking error? Mark's lips twitched. Right. Or she was accidentally upgraded. But why would an upgrade system pick her? Dorothy let them speak. She did not look away. In that moment, she was both spectator and conductor, allowing the performance to reach its crescendo. Caroline walked toward the galley, where she whispered instructions into a headset. A moment later, Mark was at Dorothy's side again. "Mrs. Coleman," he said, forcing cheer, "would you mind if I verified your ticket? One more time?" Dorothy lifted an eyebrow, but opened her tote without a word, producing her boarding pass. She extended it calmly, her gaze unwavering. "Here it is," she said. "Seat 1C." Mark hovered, scrutinizing the pass as though it held an invisible watermark. He sighed before handing it back with a hesitant nod. "Thank you, I apologize. Just procedure." Dorothy tucked the pass into her pocket and leaned back. The leather seat felt solid, supportive. She inhaled another slow breath, thinking of the day she and her late husband had signed the papers to establish Liberty Jetways, a small charter outfit that had grown into this transcontinental airline. She remembered the countless nights spent planning routes, negotiating fuel contracts, and fighting every ounce of prejudice that had threatened to keep them grounded. If only they'd known then that adversity would still find them at 40,000 feet. The engines spooled louder. Dorothy closed her eyes, the cabin lights dimming for takeoff prep. She welcomed the hum that coursed through the fuselage, a reminder of the power at her fingertips, both literally and metaphorically. She pictured her tapping a single command, summoning the executive team in Manhattan, initiating the legacy clause hidden deep in the corporate charter. The seatbelt sign dinged on. Dorothy clicked her belt securely. Beside her, the businessman in 1A adjusted his tie, offering a curt nod. A woman in 2A straightened her silk scarf and leaned forward, watching Dorothy with newfound curiosity. Across the aisle, Caroline passed with a thermos of water, avoiding Dorothy's eyes. Dorothy lifted her chin. Today, the cabin was not just a backdrop for luxury. It was an arena for justice. She tasted triumph in the coffee's bitterness, felt resolve in the seat beneath her, and knew that once the wheels lifted off the tarmac, the real journey would begin. Because in this hush of privilege and prejudice, Dorothy Coleman had claimed her seat, not just as a passenger, but as the steward of a legacy that no glance of judgment could ever erase. Dorothy sat poised in seat 1C, the muted hum of the cabin lulling most passengers into complacency. Everyone, that is, except the two flight attendants who watched her every move. Caroline hovered at the front, arms folded behind her back, lips pressed into a thin line. Mark lingered a few rows down, leaning against the service trolley and pretending to refill water bottles, though his eyes never left Dorothy's sweater or the silver bracelet at her wrist. Dorothy sensed the shift in the air long before any words were exchanged. A flight attendant's glance carried a silent question. What is she doing here? A passenger 2 rows back pressed closer to the aisle, trying to catch a better look. Even the soft click of a camera shutter somewhere behind her sounded louder than usual. She lifted the rim of her coffee cup in a slow, deliberate sip, tasting nothing but its bitter warmth. The cabin lights overhead glinted off the polished mahogany panel beside her, and she steadied her gaze on the window. Outside, the tarmac lay slick with morning dew beneath an uncertain sky. The aircraft was still tethered to the gate, but inside, a far more charged atmosphere had taken hold. Mark stepped into her peripheral vision, voice low but firm. "Mrs. Coleman, we'd like to confirm your ticket one more time. There seems to be some confusion." His tone was apologetic on the surface, but the tension in his posture spoke of doubt and disdain. Dorothy set her cup down gently. She turned in her seat, offering him the same calm expression she used in every boardroom she'd ever chaired. "I've shown it twice already," she said evenly. "Please, by all means, check it again." Mark unfolded her boarding pass and studied it under the soft glow of his smartphone flashlight. He tapped the screen, consulted his tablet, and then looked up at Dorothy with an entirely predictable question. "Are you sure this is your seat? Maybe you were upgraded by mistake?" A ripple of whispers darted through nearby seats, some sympathetic, many curious. Dorothy felt the familiar ache of indignity echo from a lifetime of small humiliations. Every time a stranger doubted her worth because of her age, her skin color, or her attire, she had to steel herself against the urge to snap back. She lifted her head and smiled, soft but steady. "Yes, I paid for this ticket. Seat 1C, first class, full fare." Mark met her gaze, blinking as though surprised by the firmness in her voice. He handed back the pass. "Of course, my apologies." His words hung in the cabin like a fragment, half-hearted and insufficient. Caroline drifted down the aisle then, brisk footsteps muffled on the plush carpet. She stood beside Dorothy, voice pitched low. "Mrs. Coleman, it's not our policy to ask other first-class passengers for ID. We just want to make sure everything's in order before departure." Her eyes flicked over Dorothy's hands, her sweater, the plain canvas tote at Dorothy's feet. Dorothy's chest tightened. She spoke softly. "I understand you have procedures, but I've done everything required. If you continue to single me out, it feels personal." Caroline straightened, color rising in her cheeks. "I'm simply doing my job." "Your job?" Dorothy's voice caught the attention of half a dozen passengers. "Or your assumptions?" She leaned forward, spine straight, chin lifted. "Why am I the only passenger asked to verify beyond my boarding pass?" An awkward silence fell. Caroline's nostrils flared, a telltale sign Dorothy recognized from decades of negotiating tough boardroom showdowns. Caroline glanced at Mark, who folded his arms and avoided Dorothy's eyes. A child farther back let out a soft whimper, reminding everyone that this was still just a commercial flight. Caroline clasped her hands together. "We just want to prevent any errors with seating, and I appreciate that," Dorothy said, voice calm but resolute. "But please understand that asking me alone repeatedly sends a message. It suggests you think I don't belong here." Caroline's jaw tightened. She leaned in, lowering her voice as though imparting a secret. "You do understand this is a privilege class, right? We cater to a certain clientele." Her emphasis on certain clientele felt like a punch. Dorothy closed her eyes for a second, tasting the sting of Caroline's words. She pictured her husband at her side, listening to every humiliating jab she'd endured over their 50 years together. She pictured their earliest days, sleeping on cots in a small Charleston apartment, dreaming of an airline that would treat everyone with dignity. An airline they named Liberty Jetways. Dorothy opened her eyes and let a small smile play at her lips. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the curve of someone who had learned to harness her indignation into a tool for change. "Liberty Jetways," she said, speaking loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "was founded on the principle that dignity isn't reserved for some. It's guaranteed for all who choose to fly with us." A collective murmur spread through the cabin. Caroline's eyes widened, her posture collapsing under the unexpected rebuke. Mark looked anywhere but at Dorothy. He shuffled his feet, clearing his throat. A passenger in seat 2A, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a sympathetic expression, leaned over. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Dorothy. "They shouldn't treat you like this." Dorothy gave her a small nod of thanks. She glanced back at Caroline and Mark. "If you believe my ticket is invalid, please direct me to the gate agent. Otherwise, I'll remain in my seat." Carolyn flushed, clearly unsettled by the firmness in Dorothy's tone. She muttered something under her breath, unintelligible but laced with frustration. "Fine," she said at last. "I'll clear this up." Dorothy settled back into her seat as Caroline retreated. She propped her paperback on her lap again, but didn't open it. Instead, she tucked a strand of silver hair behind her ear and folded her hands over her book. The cabin lights dimmed to signal imminent departure, and the flight attendants began their safety briefing. Dorothy listened to the standard announcements: life vests under seats, oxygen masks dropping from the overhead panel, exits on both sides of the plane. She watched Caroline's immaculate performance, every practiced gesture and sinewy smile, and recognized how easily protocol could be twisted into prejudice. As the engines powered up, Dorothy allowed herself a quiet satisfaction. She had made her point without raising her voice. She had stood her ground with unwavering dignity, demonstrating the power of quiet resolve. The world beyond those cabin walls might not yet understand her name, but they would see her presence, and perhaps, after today, question their own assumptions. The seatbelt sign blinked. Dorothy clicked hers firmly, leaning back, eyes forward. The rumble of thrust under the wings grew louder, and the nose of the aircraft lifted gently off the ground. In that moment of ascent, Dorothy felt the subtle shift of power settle around her. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and prepared herself for what was to come, because this was only the beginning. And in the hush of that first-class cabin, Dorothy Coleman claimed more than a seat. She claimed a voice that no glance of doubt could ever take away. Dorothy Coleman remained seated in one seat for another few moments after Caroline's curt dismissal, her fingers lightly tracing the embossed Liberty Jetways logo on the armrest. The cabin lights were dimmed for takeoff, and the gentle vibration of engines warming up thrummed beneath her feet. Around her, passengers buckled their seatbelts, swiveled their seats to face forward, and adjusted pillows behind their necks. A soft hush settled over the cabin. Everyone ready, it seemed, for the flight ahead. But Dorothy was not moving. She inhaled deeply, tasting the metallic tang of recycled air mixed with the faint scent of lavender from Caroline's perfume. The remainder of her coffee sat untouched in its cup holder, its warmth long-turned lukewarm. She lifted her gaze to the ceiling, steeling herself against the tidal wave of emotion rising from within. The sting of betrayal, the ache of public shame, the sudden, sharp pang of loneliness. Then came the soft click of high heels on carpet behind her. Caroline appeared at her side, the same practiced smile hovering on her lips, but failing to reach her eyes. "Mrs. Coleman," she said, voice low but firm, "I'm sorry, but you must vacate your seat. We need to ensure everything is correct before takeoff." Dorothy closed her eyes and let the words wash over her, as if they were an icy wave crashing against her dignity. She opened them again, calm and resolute. "I've already shown my boarding pass twice," she replied softly. "I am in the correct seat." Caroline straightened, her voice lowering almost to a whisper that carried across 3 rows. "I understand, but unless you cooperate, I will have to ask you to leave this cabin." A collective murmur rippled through first class, a brief crackle of confusion and discomfort. Dorothy could feel every pair of eyes shift toward her, weighing her worth with unspoken verdicts. Some faces held sympathy. Others bore the thin, tight-lipped disinterest of observers who did not wish to get involved. A young woman 2 rows back exchanged worried glances with her partner, pressing a hand over her mouth. A businessman near the front shifted uneasily in his seat. Dorothy drew in a steadying breath. She straightened in her chair and stood, brushing invisible lint from her sweater. Her silhouette, bathed in the soft cabin light, resembled that of a monarch at court. Smaller, yes, but no less regal for her age or attire. "Very well," she said, voice measured. "I will go, only because I do not wish to cause a disruption for other passengers." Her words fell like a stone in water, sending ripples of stunned silence through the cabin. Caroline's lips parted as though to speak, then closed again. Mark, standing at the service trolley, swallowed visibly, his face losing its earlier smugness. Dorothy turned and crossed the aisle, her canvas tote pressed like an anchor in her hand. Every footstep echoed, a staccato refrain that marked her progress out of the lavish seat she had purchased fair and square. She passed seat after seat, each one a silent judge. Some heads bowed in apology, others remained fixed ahead, as if her presence had awakened an uncomfortable truth they preferred to ignore. A mother with an infant in 2A whispered, "Bless her heart," and pressed her lips together in sympathy. An elderly couple in 1A looked at each other, their eyes dampening. But a few seats back, a young man in a designer suit simply turned away, pulling his newspaper up to hide his gaze. As Dorothy reached the bulkhead, Caroline approached, offering a hand, an odd gesture that felt halfway between assistance and assertion of authority. Dorothy refused it, stepping aside. Caroline cleared her throat. "Follow me, please." They descended the short staircase into economy class, the plush luxury of first class giving way to tighter rows and fabric seats. The fluorescent overhead lights felt harsher here, the murmur of voices louder. Dorothy's chest tightened, the weight of every insult she'd ever endured pressed against her heart. But she refused to let her shoulders slump. She held her head high. At the bottom of the stairs, Mark hovered beside the service cart, his face etched with remorse. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said quietly. "I truly apologize for how you were treated." Dorothy paused, meeting his gaze. For a moment, she saw in his pale blue eyes a flicker of something new. Remorse, perhaps? Or the first glimmer of conscience? She inclined her head. "Thank you," she replied, voice low but genuine. "But apology alone does not change anything." Economy passengers stole curious glances as she crossed the aisle and settled into a middle seat. The man across from her shifted his bag to make room. A woman behind offered a sympathetic nod. Dorothy extracted her tote and placed it on her lap, smoothing its worn fabric as though it were a ceremonial banner. She clicked her seatbelt with a quiet click that seemed louder in the closer quarters. The man next to her smiled awkwardly. "Are you all right?" he asked in a hushed tone. Dorothy offered a small, kind smile. "I will be," she said. "Thank you." He nodded, looking as though he wished he could offer more but drew back, unwilling to intrude. Dorothy turned back to the window, letting the past few minutes settle around her like dust. She closed her eyes, recalling the countless times she and her late husband had fought for dignity. On crowded runways, in musty boardrooms, even in court filings. They had built Liberty jetways on the promise of respect for all passengers. Her heart tightened at the betrayal. But beneath the ache lay a flicker of determination, a spark that had kept her moving forward through decades of challenges. She inhaled deeply, as though drawing strength from the stale cabin air. The flight attendants began the safety demonstration again, their voices blending into the hum of the engines ramping up. Dorothy watched Mark standing near the galley. His posture had straightened, his eyes unfocused for a moment. Caroline passed by, her cool smile replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Dorothy realized then that they could not unsee what they'd done. The echo of her silent dignity lingered in every seat. She reached into her tote and withdrew her boarding pass again, smoothing its edge between her fingers. The embossed gold seal of Liberty jetways shone under the harsh lights. She pressed the paper to her heart, feeling the power encoded in that small legal emblem, the secret clause that granted her the right to veto any action against the airline's founding values. As the plane began its acceleration down the runway, Dorothy pressed her forehead against the cool window pane. Outside, the concrete blurred and twisted beneath the engine's roar. Inside, she closed her eyes, embracing the rush of air, the jolt of liftoff, the silent promise that justice would follow. Today, she had lost a seat. Tomorrow, she would claim something far greater. The engines rumbled louder, lifting the aircraft into the dimly lit sky. Dorothy Coleman sat back, shoulders squared, eyes closed, and prepared for the confrontation that would restore not only her dignity, but Liberty Jetways itself. Dorothy Coleman's heart pounded as she crossed the threshold from first class into the economy cabin. Each step heavier than the last. The plush leather seats and wide aisles that had once welcomed her with quiet luxury gave way to rows of slim fabric seats packed tightly together. The overhead bins were lower, the lighting sharper, and the hum of voices, children fussing, flight attendants calling snack orders, felt far more insistent. A knot of passengers watched her pass, their expressions a strange mix of curiosity and sympathy. A woman in 12B offered her a pitying smile. A college student in 14C stared wide-eyed. A father in 11A returned to his newspaper as if to say, "Don't look at her." None spoke. No one stood to offer their seat. Dorothy felt every glance, every unspoken question. Why is she here? She reached seat 17D, the middle seat, and paused. The flight attendant who had accompanied her, Mark, hovered behind, shifting from foot to foot. Dorothy placed her tote on the empty adjacent seat, a gesture of claiming dignity even in this cramped row. She slipped into the seat, settling the tote across her lap so it wouldn't be mistaken for an extra passenger's bag. "Here you go, ma'am," Mark said quietly, handing her the same cup of water he'd offered in first class. His voice sounded smaller here, as though he regretted the order he'd been given. Dorothy took the cup and nodded. "Thank you," she said. No "I'm sorry," no shrug. She didn't need apologies. She needed justice. Across the aisle, a young mother in 16C whispered to her toddler, "It's okay, honey." The toddler's wide eyes flicked toward Dorothy's sweater, still the same simple gray knit, but then returned to her snack. Dorothy allowed herself a soft smile. If the little girl could find comfort here, maybe dignity wasn't confined to leather armchairs. She tucked her paperback into her tote and smoothed her hands over its worn cover. The airplane's safety briefing began anew. Seatbelts, oxygen masks, emergency exits. The cadence was familiar, almost soothing. Dorothy closed her eyes for a moment, letting the mechanical voice wash over her. In first class, the humiliation had been public, a glaring spotlight. Here, it was quieter, but no less powerful. The scratch of tight seatbelt straps, the lack of armrest space, elbows brushing strangers in the narrow aisle. Economy was a world apart, and Dorothy felt the divide like a chasm. Yet she refused to let it define her. A flight attendant trolley rattled down the aisle, and Mark paused beside Dorothy's row. He checked his clipboard. "May I offer you a snack, Mrs. Coleman? We have crackers and cheese." Dorothy lifted an eyebrow. "Thank you, but I'll pass." He nodded, folding his arms. "If there's anything else..." She cut him off gently. "Just the water is fine." He looked at her with something in his eyes that mirrored her own resilience. Regret. Then he moved on, leaving Dorothy alone with her thoughts and the steady drone of the engines. She gazed out the window at clouds drifting by, billows of ivory and silver, offering no judgment, only quiet acceptance. Dorothy thought of her husband, James, who had built Liberty Jetways from a handful of routes and a dream of fairness. He had insisted they treat every passenger, regardless of station or style, with respect. That conviction had fueled them through lean years and stormy weather. Dorothy recalled the day she and James had drafted the legacy clause, hidden within legal language so arcane that only a handful of lawyers and board members knew it existed. She'd insisted on it partly out of love, partly out of fear. Fear that someday someone would forget why they started this company, would put prejudice before principle. Today that fear had come to pass under Caroline's judgmental gaze. She tightened the strap of her seatbelt, feeling its snug embrace. In first class, she had worn her dignity like an invisible crown. Here, she would carry it beneath her sweater. The difference in seats did not change who she was. Beside her, a man in 18F unwrapped a candy bar, throwing her a quick, awkward glance. Dorothy nodded politely, a silent thanks for not staring. In economy, the camaraderie of shared discomfort sometimes blossomed into kindness. She thought of the woman in 12B, the mother in 11A, the toddler. All little reminders that empathy could survive even cramped quarters. The captain's voice crackled through. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be cruising at 35,000 feet shortly. You may now use electronic devices." The seatbelt sign dinged off. All at once, passengers leaned back, retrieved tablets and phones, whispered to one another. Dorothy exhaled, releasing the last of the knot in her chest. She lifted the window shade and peered out. The plane's wings sliced through a sea of clouds, sunlight dancing along its polished edge. It was a sight she'd admired hundreds of times, but never with quite this sense of purpose. She had been relegated to economy, but she was still soaring. Not just in flight, but in conviction. Her phone buzzed gently against her tote. A text from Malcolm. "Mom, I saw what happened. I'm on my way. Love you." Dorothy felt a surge of warmth. He was coming, not with anger, but with solidarity. They would face this together, but she would no longer endure it alone. She typed back a simple reply. "Stay calm. I'm fine." The message sent, Dorothy leaned back and closed her eyes, letting the hum of the cabin and the pulse of the engines carry her forward. Her fingers paused at the bracelet on her wrist. The single piece of silver she wore every day, a keepsake from James. It gleamed faintly in the dim light. In that moment, Dorothy made a silent vow. This indignity would not stand. The seat might be narrower, the service humbler, but her resolve was boundless. She pictured the conference room in Manhattan, the moment when the legacy clause would be invoked, when she would step to the front and remind everyone of Liberty Jetway's true foundation. She opened her eyes and met Marks across the aisle. His face was apologetic, but resolute. He would bear witness to the change coming. Dorothy offered him a small, genuine smile. "Thank you," she mouthed. He nodded once, his own unspoken promise echoing back at her. Outside, the sun glinted off the clouds. Economy or first class, Dorothy Coleman was airborne in more ways than one. And as Liberty Jetway's Flight 277 leveled off into its cruise altitude, she leaned into the gentle drone of the engines and prepared for the revolution that awaited. One that would lift every passenger to the dignity they deserved. Dorothy Coleman settled deeper into her economy class seat, the narrow aisle's bustle now a distant hum compared to the icy tension of first class. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself against the lingering ache of public humiliation. Around her, passengers fumbled with overhead bins, children kicked seatbacks, and flight attendants rattled drink carts. But Dorothy felt removed from it all, anchored instead by a purpose that swelled in her chest. She reached into her canvas tote and produced her phone, its leather case soft from years of use. With deft fingers, she tapped the screen and unlocked it. The home screen appeared innocuous, a cluster of commonplace apps, news, email, weather, but in the lower right corner, hidden in plain sight under a faded icon labeled Legacy Health, lay the real tool she'd carried for decades. Dorothy's thumb hovered over the icon for a heartbeat, just long enough to feel the gravity of what she was about to do, then pressed it. The app's interface shimmered, transforming into a sleek dashboard bathed in midnight blue. At the top, a line of tiny text read, "Property of Liberty Jetways Founders Council." Below, 3 buttons glowed with soft intensity: Review Charter, Activate Clause, and Emergency Contact. Dorothy exhaled slowly, remembering the conversation she'd had with her late husband the day they'd added this feature to the company's charter. They had insisted on a fail-safe mechanism to protect Liberty's founding ideals, a secret veto power to be used only in dire circumstances. Her fingers swiped to Review Charter, and the original founding document appeared. Scanning the carefully worded paragraphs, she paused at Article 4, Section 7, the so-called Legacy Clause. In the event that any passenger or employee of Liberty Jetways is subjected to discriminatory or prejudicial treatment in direct violation of the company's founding principles of dignity and equality, the sole surviving founder retains the right to invoke an immediate executive veto. Upon activation, this veto shall trigger a mandatory company-wide board meeting within 24 hours and may, at the founder's discretion, suspend or restructure any affected operational division. She traced the words with her thumb, feeling the weight of 40 years of fights, triumphs, and quiet resilience that had brought them to this moment. With trembling calm, she tapped Activate Clouds. A confirmation dialog glowed on the screen. You are about to invoke the Legacy Clause. This action will summon an emergency board session and issue executive directives to Liberty Jetways leadership. Continue? Dorothy's breath caught. She pressed her phone closer, reflecting on the flicker of doubt in Caroline's eyes, the quiver in Mark's voice when he'd apologized. This was not vengeance, it was accountability. She tapped Confirm. Instantly, the screen shifted to an activation summary. Timestamp 9:47 a.m. EDT. Location: in-flight, flight LJ247. Authority: Dorothy Coleman, co-founder and sole legacy veto holder. Action: emergency board meeting initiated. Suspend first-class service division pending review. Issue company-wide memo reaffirming anti-discrimination policy. A progress bar spun for a few seconds, then a green check mark glowed beside each line item. Below, a note read, "Notification sent to all board members and executive officers." Dorothy straightened, her heart pounding with sudden clarity and quiet triumph. She pressed emergency contact to send a short, secure message to Malcolm Coleman's private device. Her thumb flew over the touch. "Malcolm, I've just invoked the Legacy Clause. Expect a board summons within 24 hours, details to follow." "Mom." A tiny alert popped up. Message delivered to CEO and Founders Council. She slid the phone back into her tote and closed her eyes, letting the cabin's ambient drone wash over her. Passengers shifted around her, completely unaware that their airline's fate had just been set into motion by the unassuming woman in 17D. The engine's steady thrum felt like the heartbeat of Liberty itself, a company born from her and James's dream of fairness, now preserved by her resolute act. Dorothy opened her eyes and glanced at the window. The plane was climbing above a sea of cumulus clouds, sunlight glinting off the wing's leading edge. She allowed herself a small, private smile. This flight would end like no other. The silent injustice she'd endured was about to become the catalyst for a transformation that rippled far beyond a single cabin. A young man in 17C nudged her gently. "Are you okay, ma'am?" he asked, genuine concern softening his features. Dorothy returned his gaze with warmth. "I'm better than okay," she replied, voice low but firm. "Thank you." He offered her a thumbs up, then returned to his magazine. The moment was fleeting, but it underscored something vital. True dignity didn't depend on one's seat assignment. It emanated from one's actions. And Dorothy's next move would define the company she'd helped build. A flight attendant wheeled a cart down the aisle, and Dorothy caught the attendant's eye. The attendant gave her a polite bow, no hesitation this time, no trace of doubt. Dorothy nodded in return. In that brief exchange, she tasted the first hint of reparation. She leaned back, rested her hands on her tote, and closed her eyes. The cabin lights dimmed further for the flight's cruise phase, and the hush deepened. In the quiet cocoon of economy class, a great upheaval was underway. Dorothy could almost feel the gears of power shifting miles below her fingertips. She thought of her husband, James, and how passionate they'd been about crafting an airline that elevated every passenger, regardless of creed, color, or circumstance. That vision had weathered many storms, but the storm they faced today was the fiercest. Internal prejudice that threatened to undermine their core promise. Dorothy had chosen not to confront it with anger or spectacle, but with the measured authority granted by decades of stewardship. Across the aisle, Caroline's face flickered in Dorothy's peripheral vision, there for a moment, then gone, as the attendant moved on. Dorothy welcomed the sight. It confirmed that her legacy clause had become more than a dormant clause on paper. It was now a living instrument of justice. A soft chime sounded from Dorothy's tote, a discreet confirmation that the board summons had been acknowledged. She tapped the bag thoughtfully, then settled back to rest. The engine's sigh blended with her own slower breaths. This flight's turbulence had been more than mechanical. It had been moral. And now, firmly lodged in an economy seat, Dorothy would watch Liberty Jetways realign itself with the ideals she and James had championed all those years ago. In the gentle hush of cruise altitude, Dorothy closed her eyes once more. She felt an unwavering calm settle through her veins. The humiliation of first class was in the past. Ahead lay a reckoning, and a renewed promise of dignity for every passenger who chose to fly with Liberty Jetways. The cabin around her may not have known it yet, but the company's soul had just awakened. As the plane sailed on through endless blue, Dorothy Coleman rested with the quiet certitude of one who knew she'd done what was right, and set a legacy in motion that no prejudice could ever ground again. Dorothy's eyes were closed when the pilot's voice crackled through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have received an urgent directive from Liberty Jetways Executive Command. Please remain seated as we prepare to turn back to JFK. I apologize for the inconvenience." Economy class erupted in confused chatter. Dorothy opened her eyes, her heart lifting at the familiar tug of justice beginning to unfold. She'd been sure her invocation of the legacy clause would matter, but this rapid response still felt like a small miracle. Around her, passengers exchanged startled glances. A young engineer jabbed at her phone. An elderly tourist adjusted her hearing aid. Mark and Caroline, now hovering near the galley, froze in mid-step. Caroline's perfect composure cracked, her jaw tightening as she whispered to Mark, "Did you authorize this?" Mark's face paled. I didn't. A hush fell as the aircraft banked gently, the wingtip cutting through a sunlit swirl of clouds. Dorothy felt the shift in momentum under her fingertips. Justice, it seemed, moved as swiftly as a jetliner. Moments later, a flight attendant's voice announced, "Will the passenger in 1CM's Dorothy Coleman kindly make her way to the front of the cabin?" Dorothy's pulse quickened. The entire plane seemed to lean in, drawn by the promise of something extraordinary. She tucked her tote under her arm, smoothed her gray sweater, and stood. The narrow aisle felt charged, every overhead bin and seat back suddenly conspiring to echo her footsteps. As she ascended the short staircase into first class, the cabin lights brightened. Caroline and Mark stepped aside, mouths agape. Dorothy paused at the threshold, inhaled once, then continued until she reached the front row. Passengers in 1A through 2D leaned forward, curiosity and surprise flickering across their faces. At the very front, a door swung open, revealing Malcolm Coleman, CEO of Liberty Jetways. Standing tall in a sharply tailored navy suit and crisp white shirt, his tie, the exact shade of the airline's logo, was perfectly knotted. In one hand, he held a slim tablet. In the other, he pushed back a lock of dark hair streaked with salt and pepper. For a heartbeat, neither he nor Dorothy spoke. Then Malcolm's gaze found his mother's, and his solemn expression cracked into a tender smile. He set the tablet on a nearby seat and reached out, hand extended. "Mom," he said, voice rich with relief and barely contained emotion. Dorothy returned his smile, eyes misting. She took his hand and let him guide her to a vacant seat in the very center of first class. The cabin, once a stage for her humiliation, now felt like an amphitheater of penance. Malcolm turned to the assembled passengers and crew, his voice firm yet compassionate. "Everyone, I apologize for the treatment my mother experienced today. She is not only my mother, but the co-founder of Liberty Jetways, and the only person in our company with the power to invoke our legacy clause. That clause was created to protect every passenger's dignity. I ask for your understanding as we correct this wrong." A stunned hush followed. Caroline's hand flew to her throat. Mark's eyes widened as though he'd seen a ghost. Passengers shifted in their seats, some nodding slowly, others blinking away tears. A woman in 2A reached out to Dorothy's hand. A businessman in 1A quietly muttered, "I'm so sorry." Malcolm stepped closer, lowering his voice so Dorothy could hear. "You were right, Mom. They shouldn't have treated you, or anyone, this way." Dorothy's heart swelled. She looked around at the faces in the cabin, the mother and infant, now smiling. The teenager in 1D, holding his tablet at an angle so everyone could see the news alert. Liberty Jetways, Flight 2.7. Legacy clause invoked. Even Caroline and Mark seemed suspended in a moment of dawning regret. Malcolm addressed Caroline directly. "Caroline, please ensure my mother is fully accommodated for the rest of this flight. And Mark?" He paused, catching Mark's eye. "Thank you for your apology. Let's all commit to ensuring no passenger ever endures this again." Caroline swallowed and nodded. "Yes, Mr. Coleman, of course." Mark gave a small, shaky smile. "Absolutely, sir." Malcolm turned back to the cabin. "I also want to thank everyone aboard for your patience. We will treat this flight, and all of our flights, with the respect and care you deserve." He offered Dorothy his arm, and together they returned to seat 1C. Dorothy sat, the leather embracing her as though it recognized her claim. Malcolm sank into the seat beside her, folding an arm protectively around her shoulders. The tinny echo of seatbelt signs dimmed into the background as Dorothy looked out at the cloud-studded canopy. She pressed her head gently against Malcolm's arm. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in our dream." Malcolm kissed the top of her head. "Always." Behind them, the first-class cabin reconfigured itself. Champagne glasses reappeared, blankets were refolded, and the soft scent of lavender returned, this time without the undercurrent of tension. Economy Class 2 felt changed. Dorothy glimpsed passengers leaning forward, sharing smiles and nods across the aisle. The toddler in 12C waved at Dorothy through the bulkhead window. Dorothy waved back, her heart light. Above the engine's steady drone, Dorothy heard the soft click of her phone. She'd received a flurry of messages from board members, confirming the emergency meeting time and location. The legacy clause had done its work, activating a board-level reckoning that would echo through Liberty Jetway's corridors for weeks to come. Dorothy closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the quiet exultation. At 71 years old, she'd never imagined she'd stand here, vindicated, respected, and restored to the seat she'd earned. She opened her eyes and looked at her son, still by her side, and felt a profound gratitude. The seatbelt sign chimed off again, and Malcolm gave her a gentle squeeze. "Mom, can I get you some coffee?" "First class blend. On me." She chuckled softly. "I'd like that." As Malcolm rose, the cabin lights dimmed once more to a soft glow. Dorothy leaned back into her seat, her eyes tracing the polished contours of the cabin she'd once been forced to leave. But tonight, in this moment, she was home. And somewhere high above the clouds, Liberty Jetways was already turning itself toward a new horizon, one rooted in the dignity and equality Dorothy had championed since its founding. The doors to Liberty Jetways' makeshift conference room at JFK's Executive Lounge slid open with a soft hiss, and Dorothy Coleman stepped inside. The room was a far cry from the plush leather of first class. Walls of brushed metal and glass, rows of teak conference tables, and chairs upholstered in muted gray. Fluorescent lights overhead hummed quietly. At the head of the table, a digital clock blinked 10:15, I am mean, indicating barely 28 minutes since Dorothy had activated the legacy clause. Seated around the table were the airline's senior leadership, the COO in a navy suit, the CFO with a stack of financial reports, the CHRO clutching a tablet flagged with diversity training, and, impossibly, Caroline and Mark, still in their crisp uniforms, faces ashen. Whispers darted through the group like startled birds as Dorothy crossed the room, her simple gray sweater and khaki slacks marking her silhouette against their tailored business attire. No one rose. No one offered a seat. Dorothy paused at the head of the table, letting her gaze sweep over the assembled faces. She placed her canvas tote on the table with deliberate calm, the worn fabric a sharp contrast to their sleek portfolios. Finally, she sat. No introduction, no flourish. The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. Caroline's perfectly coiffed hair quivered slightly. Mark's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. The executives exchanged uneasy looks, as though unsure which protocol to follow. Clearing her throat once, Dorothy folded her hands in front of her and spoke, voice steady yet resonant. "Good morning," she said simply. "I've called this meeting under the authority granted to me in the 1985 Founders Charter, specifically Article 4, Section 7. A ripple of recognition passed through the room. Even the COO's expression, usually unreadable, flickered with alarm. "This morning," Dorothy continued, "one of our own flight attendants forced me back from my purchased first-class seat into economy, based solely on my appearance. It was a blatant violation of our founding principle that every passenger has the right to dignity." She paused, letting the words settle. Liberty Jetways was born from a commitment to fairness. Yet today, we failed that commitment. Caroline's cheeks flushed. She tried to speak, but words caught in her throat. Mark bowed his head, ashamed. The CFO shifted uneasily and bit his lip. The CHRO's fingers tightened around the tablet. Dorothy held her gaze, calm but unyielding. "This isn't merely a human resources incident," she said. "It is an existential one. If we cannot uphold the values that launched this airline, then what purpose do we serve?" Dorothy leaned forward, voice taking on a quiet intensity. "I've invoked the legacy clause to summon an immediate board session. Within 24 hours, we will convene every division head. We will conduct a full review of our service protocols, retrain every member of our staff on unconscious bias, and restructure our first-class division under direct oversight from the Founders Council. We will issue a formal apology to every passenger aboard Flight 27, and we will make public our renewed pledge to equality. The COO opened his mouth, then closed it. The CFO exhaled, pushing the financial reports aside. Caroline looked as though she might collapse. Mark stood rigid, tears glimmering in his eyes. Dorothy sat back, letting the weight of her words settle over them like a mantle. Liberty Jetways exists to carry people, not prejudice, she said softly. If even one passenger is made to feel less than human, we have lost our way. Dorothy rose, gathering her tote. We begin today, she said, her tone both promise and warning. I expect full cooperation. She turned on her heel and walked briskly out of the room, the doors closing behind her with a decisive click. In the stunned silence that followed, Liberty Jetways leadership faced a stark choice: retreat behind excuses or recommit to the very ideals that had given them flight. The morning sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Liberty Jetways' Manhattan headquarters, illuminating a row of cameras and reporters gathered in the sleek lobby. News crews from every major network stood ready, microphones and recorders at the ready. Rumors of an emergency press conference had circulated since Dorothy Coleman's legacy clause activation, and now all eyes were fixed on the entrance. Dorothy and her son Malcolm emerged side by side, the sharp cut of their silhouettes cutting through the buzz of eager anticipation. Dorothy's gray sweater and worn khaki slacks contrasted with Malcolm's navy suit, but they shared the same resolute calm. Behind them, a silent phalanx of board members and senior executives followed, some looking unsteady, others resolved to support the changes their founding mother had set in motion. Malcolm stepped forward to a single podium emblazoned with the Liberty Jetways logo. He waited for the last rustle of cables to settle, then spoke, voice clear. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. My mother, Dorothy Coleman, invoked the legacy clause this morning to address a serious breach of our company's founding values." He gestured toward Dorothy, who nodded slightly. Dorothy stepped up to the podium. Her presence was commanding yet unassuming, an older woman who had spent a lifetime tempering strength with humility. She adjusted the microphone and looked out over the sea of lenses. "Earlier today, I was forcibly removed from my purchased first-class seat on Flight 207, she began, voice steady, back into his own mount. That action was not merely an error in judgment. It was a flagrant violation of the principle upon which Liberty Jetways was built, that every passenger, regardless of appearance, background, or attire, deserves respect and dignity. A reporter raised her hand. Dorothy acknowledged her with a nod. The reporter asked, "Mrs. Coleman, what specific actions are you announcing today?" Dorothy took a breath and continued, "Effective immediately, I have ordered the following measures. Termination of the Flight 2.7 crew. The 5 flight attendants directly responsible for the incident will be relieved of duty and their employment with Liberty Jetways terminated. Ascension of the head of human resources. Pending a full audit of our hiring and training practices, our CHRO is placed on immediate administrative leave. Establishment of the board's Dignity and Equality Council. A new internal committee empowered to review all operational protocols, deploy regular unconscious bias training, and issue corrective actions up to 15% salary penalties for executives who fail to comply with our code of conduct. These steps are not retribution. They are the beginning of our company's rebirth." Silence rippled through the room as Dorothy's words hung in the air. Malcolm stood slightly behind her, pride shining in his eyes, even as he fought back emotion. Reporters scribbled notes furiously. Cameras flashed. One skeptical reporter pressed, "Mrs. Coleman, some critics will call this symbolic. How can you ensure these measures lead to real change?" Dorothy's gaze never wavered. "Symbols become reality only when we bind them to action," she said. "Liberty Jetways will publish quarterly reports on our cultural training, diversity metrics, and disciplinary actions. Our customers deserve transparency, and I will hold this company accountable to that promise." She stepped away from the podium, and Malcolm moved forward. "My mother didn't build Liberty Jetways to be a theater of privilege," he said warmly. "She built it to be a vessel of inclusion." Today's decisions reflect that legacy. I pledge to you all and to every passenger we serve that Liberty Jetways will live up to her ideals. After a final glance at his mother, Malcolm turned and exited the lobby. Dorothy followed, pausing only to offer a quiet smile to a young flight attendant among the press, someone from the new crew pool who'd trained for cultural sensitivity. That attendant returned her smile with a nod of respect. Behind closed doors, the board convened immediately in a glass-walled conference suite overlooking Broadway. Caroline and Mark sat at the end of the table, heads bowed, flanked by the suddenly somber CHRO. Dorothy took the head seat, reaching into her tote for the leather-bound copy of the original charter. She slid the document across the table. "This is the heart of Liberty Jetways," she said softly. "It names dignity and equality as immutable rights. We will use it to guide every decision from this moment forward." She tapped Article 4, Section 7, the Legacy Clause. "This clause isn't a gimmick. It's our moral compass." The COO leaned forward, voice hushed. "Mrs. Coleman, we understand. We need to rebuild trust, internally and publicly. We'll roll out the new council membership list tonight and schedule mandatory training sessions next week." Dorothy nodded. "And I will personally review the first report from the council in 30 days. Any failure to meet our standards will be met with swift, equivalent consequences." The CFO exhaled, setting aside her glasses. "Our investors are concerned about stock volatility. May I suggest an investor briefing?" Dorothy gave a small, wry smile. "Transparency works both ways. Inform them of our actions. They'll appreciate the clarity more than appeasement." Mark's voice quivered as he spoke. "Mrs. Coleman, I'm deeply sorry. I never meant to harm our values." His eyes glistened with tears. Caroline dabbed at her own eyes, guilt etched across her face. Dorothy reached across the table and placed a steady hand on Mark's. "I know you didn't act out of malice," she said gently. "But bias can echo louder than intent. I expect you and everyone here to learn from this. We move forward together." Outside, news of the terminations and council formation spread like wildfire. Social media feeds exploded with headlines: "Liberty Jetways founder ousts discrimination crew," and "CEO's mother sparks corporate reckoning." Calls poured into customer service lines, many praising the swift action. By evening, Liberty's stock had steadied, buoyed by broad approval of the ethical stance. Shareholders commended the move in online forums, noting that true corporate leadership demanded moral courage. Late into the night, Dorothy sat in her modest Baltimore home, wrapped in a soft blanket, the glow of her phone illuminating dozens of appreciative texts and emails. She read each message with quiet gratitude, her late husband's memory beside her in a framed photo on the mantel. A final message blinked on her screen. From Malcolm: "Thank you for saving us, Mom. I could not be prouder." Dorothy closed her eyes, allowing herself a rare moment of relief. The purge was over. The rebirth had begun. In restructuring Liberty Jetways, Dorothy Coleman had not only fired a discriminatory crew, she had reignited the founding promise of the airline itself: that dignity is a right, not a luxury. and as she drifted to sleep, the soft hum of the world beyond her windows felt like an echo of jet engines soaring toward a brighter horizon. 2 days after the dramatic press conference, Liberty Jetway's Manhattan headquarters buzzed with a different energy. Gone was the usual tension of quarterly earnings season, replaced by a determined focus on rebuilding culture. In the cavernous boardroom, Dorothy Coleman and her son Malcolm presided over a meeting of department heads, HR managers, and frontline supervisors. The long mahogany table was strewn with printed training outlines, new policy drafts, and surveys from employees across the country. Malcolm tapped the table to draw the room to order. "Thank you all for joining on such short notice," he began, voice crisp. "We've already terminated the crew responsible for Flight 207 and suspended our HR lead pending audit. Now comes the hard part. Ensuring that Liberty Jetways lives up to the values my mother and father built this company on." He gestured to Dorothy. "Mom." Dorothy rose, adjusting the silver bracelet on her wrist, a keepsake from the airline's earliest days. She looked around at the faces before her, many of them familiar executives who'd worked long hours to grow the airline, but had overlooked its darker blind spots. "Today," she said, "we begin a comprehensive cultural overhaul. This isn't a one-off training session or a press release. It's a fundamental reset of how we hire, onboard, and manage every employee, especially those in customer-facing roles." She clicked a remote, and the large screen behind her flickered to life with a slide titled Project Phoenix, Rebuilding with Dignity. The first bullet read, 1. Mandatory anti-bias training. All 6,000 employees must complete interactive unconscious bias modules within 30 days. External experts from the National Equity Institute will co-facilitate workshops at each hub. Dorothy continued, "We've allocated $2 million, 0 cents, to develop these programs, ensuring they're not just check-the-box exercises, but immersive experiences." She clicked again. 2. Revised Code of Conduct. New section on respect in action, explicit examples of unacceptable behavior and clear consequences. Quarterly culture scorecards tied to performance reviews and eligibility for bonuses. "We'll roll out the updated code next week," Dorothy said. "Managers will hold team discussions to unpack each section." She paused, letting the weight of accountability settle over the room. "I want every employee to know exactly what we expect and why it matters." Malcolm took over. "Next, we're creating the Dignity and Equality Council, an internal watchdog with real teeth. 20 members drawn from HR, operations, flight crews, and passenger services will meet monthly to review incidents, analyze our diversity metrics, and recommend corrective actions directly to me and the board. No filters, no delays." The COO leaned forward, eyebrows raised. "Will council findings be public?" he asked. Dorothy nodded. "We'll publish a quarterly report on libertyjetways.com. Transparency builds trust with our employees and our passengers." Over the next hour, they walked through each initiative. Peer-to-peer mentoring programs, a redesigned onboarding experience that embedded inclusion from day one, and a new recognition system, Liberty Stars, to celebrate employees who exemplified the airline's renewed values. The budget sheet showed $5 million, 0 cents, total investment over the next fiscal year, funded by reallocating marketing dollars and a slight reduction in executive bonuses. By afternoon, the executive team dispersed to implement the plan. In Denver, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Miami, regional managers convened town halls. Each began with a live video feed from Dorothy and Malcolm, who spoke directly to employees in hangars and break rooms. "Dorothy, I'm asking you to join me in recommitting to dignity for every passenger and for each other. Malcolm, we want Liberty Jetways to be known not just for our routes, but for how we treat people. Your role matters. In each town hall, employees exchanged candid questions. A ground handler in Chicago asked about career impact. What if someone resists this change? Malcolm answered, "We'll coach, retrain, and, if necessary, reassign. But we won't tolerate willful disrespect of our values." A flight attendant in Los Angeles inquired about tips. "How do we balance schedule pressures with providing respectful service?" Dorothy replied, "Start with empathy. Put yourself in the passenger's shoes. That mindset trumps any stress." That evening, Dorothy caught a red guy to Dallas to sit in on the inaugural anti-bias workshop at Love Field. The room was filled with a diverse group: pilots in crisp uniforms, mechanics in grease-stained coveralls, ticket agents, baggage handlers. Dr. Alicia Reed from the National Equity Institute guided them through scenarios, interactive role plays that exposed subtle stereotypes and micro-inequities. Dorothy watched as participants hesitated, then leaned in, grappling with uncomfortable truths. She overheard a veteran pilot whisper, "I never realized how my tone could be dismissive." A maintenance supervisor noted, "I judge by appearance too. Didn't see it until today." Dorothy knew real change required courage to face one's own biases. At the end of the session, Dorothy stood and addressed the group. "Thank you all for your honesty," she said. "When we launched Liberty Jetways in 1985, we promised an airline free of prejudice. Today we're owning up to where we fell short and setting a course for a better future. That promise begins with you." Applause rippled through the room, tentative, then wholehearted. Back in Manhattan the next morning, Dorothy and Malcolm reviewed the first wave of feedback. Already, over 1,200 employees had completed the online training, with an average satisfaction score of 4.6 out of 5. Early council meetings uncovered systemic issues in crew scheduling that inadvertently marginalized diversity candidates. Issues slated for immediate reform. Dorothy leaned back in her chair, a quiet smile on her lips. She thought of the countless times she'd endured silent indignities, in waiting rooms, on buses, in the narrow economies of life, and how those experiences had propelled her to build Liberty Jetways. Now, her son's generation was completing that work, transforming pain into progress. That afternoon, Dorothy boarded a short charter flight to Miami, traveling in first class as an observer for the new service standards pilot. The cabin felt different. Flight attendants greeted her by name, offered genuine eye contact, and asked open-ended questions. "Is there anything more I can do to make your flight comfortable?" Dorothy responded naturally, sipping her water, watching as the crew executed each step with warmth and professionalism. A young attendant approached. "Miss Coleman, it's an honor," she said. "This new training really changed how I see my job." Dorothy placed a hand on the attendant's shoulder. "Thank you for embracing it," she replied. "Your work today means every passenger leaves here a little more respected than they felt when they arrived." As the plane banked over the sparkling Florida coastline, Dorothy gazed out the window, the final rays of sun dancing on the water below. In her heart, she felt the pain of Flight 207's humiliation finally morph into hope. A hope carried on every Liberty Jetways flight from then on. She closed her eyes, breathing in the gentle roar of the engines. The great overhaul was underway, guided by promises written decades ago and sustained by actions taken today. For Dorothy Coleman and for the airline she had helped build, it was a moment of rebirth, one that would ripple far beyond the horizon. Barely a week after Liberty Jetways' sweeping reforms made headlines, the story had spread far beyond the airline's own hangars. Major news outlets ran segments under banners like "Airline Reinvents Itself" and "A Legacy of Dignity," praising Dorothy Coleman's decisive action. Social media lit up with first-hand accounts from passengers who experienced the new service standards. Kindness in every interaction, respect in every seat assignment. Competitor airlines took notice almost immediately. At American Sky's headquarters in Dallas, CEO Rachel Kim announced a partnership with the National Equity Institute to launch her own anti-bias training. In London, the board of Global Air convened an emergency session to draft their version of Liberty's Dignity and Equality Council. Within days, Oceanic Airlines in Sydney had pledged transparency reports and public diversity scorecards. The industry's turning point came at the International Aviation Summit in New York. Dorothy and Malcolm were invited to speak on a panel titled, "From Crisis to Culture Shift." Dorothy shared the moment she activated the legacy clause, and Malcolm outlined the metrics tying employee evaluations to respect and fairness. The room, filled with senior executives from around the globe, erupted in applause, many brushing tears from their eyes, as they recognized the universal need for these values. Out of that summit, a coalition formed, the Alliance for Equality in Aviation, with founding members including Liberty Jetways, American Sky, Global Air, and Oceanic Airlines. Their joint charter committed to annual peer reviews, shared best practices, and a public hotline for reporting discriminatory incidents. Less than a month later, the Alliance had grown to uphold dignity at every altitude. Back on board a Liberty Jetways flight to Miami, Dorothy watched a young attendant greet a diverse group of first-class passengers with genuine warmth. She leaned to Malcolm and whispered, "This is the real change I hoped for." Malcolm smiled, squeezing her hand. Together, they watched as the industry shifted, one compassionate interaction at a time. 6 months had passed since Dorothy Coleman invoked the legacy clause, and Liberty Jetways had transformed in ways she could scarcely have imagined. Stepping onto flight LJ 512 from Miami to New York, she felt a gentle thrill of anticipation rather than dread. The cabin was a tapestry of diversity, an elderly Asian couple sharing a newspaper in row 1, a young black entrepreneur adjusting her laptop in row 2, a Latino father soothing his toddler in row 3. Every passenger moved with quiet confidence, as though they belonged simply by virtue of being human. Dorothy made her way to seat 1CA, a leather cradle that once bore the weight of her indignity. Today, it welcomed her with warmth. A polished flight attendant approached, clipboard in hand. "Good afternoon, Miss Coleman," she said, voice sincere and bright. "May I offer you a glass of water or perhaps our signature herbal tea?" Dorothy smiled, touched by the ease of the greeting. "Water, please," she replied. The attendant nodded, pouring crystal clear water into a glass and placing it gently in the cup holder. "We're honored to have you with us again." Dorothy took a slow sip and gazed down the aisle. There, near the galley, stood Richard, the same attendant whose bias had once exiled her to economy. His uniform fit neatly, and his posture was relaxed yet respectful. When he caught her eye, he gave a small, genuine nod of acknowledgement. In that brief gesture, a world of change passed between them. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling the faint scent of lavender and citrus that now defined Liberty's new service standard. The engines hummed smoothly as the plane taxied toward the runway, and Dorothy felt a profound peace settle in her chest. Dorothy opened her eyes and watched as the ground slipped away beneath them. What had begun as a painful struggle had become a powerful legacy. A culture of dignity that would outlast any one flight, any one passenger. As clouds drifted beneath the cabin floor, Dorothy Coleman leaned back, her heart light, knowing that the sky was finally wide open for everyone.